My phone shrieked with alerts at dawn, and the first image gutted me. My journal pages stared back from the group chat, captioned by a familiar handle. I tasted metal as the room tilted. Emily said, "Sophie, what did you do to me?" A typing bubble danced, then vanished. Sophie said, "You left me no choice." The words hit like ice water. Liam called twice, then stopped. Grace texted one sentence that burned. Grace said, "I warned her not to weaponize you." Neon from last night still hummed in my skull, a laugh echoing like a bad chord. Emily said, "We laughed together, and you fed me to wolves by morning." Sirens somewhere pressed the air thin. I pressed my thumb to delete, but the images kept multiplying like cracks in glass. The rain slapped my face like an accusation, while the city blinked awake. Emily said, "You swore we were a team." The word team broke in my mouth. I replayed last night's toast and felt the glass cut anew. Sophie said, "You never noticed how you eclipsed me." The line crawled under my skin like frost. Liam said, "Talk to me before this gets worse." His voicemail trembled with intent and guilt. I wanted to answer, but the chat kept blooming with strangers' judgments. Grace said, "Do not reply yet, breathe first." I counted breaths and tasted bitter courage. The morning smelled like wet concrete and endings, and I walked without knowing where to land. My mind stitched a reel of reasons, each looser than the last. Emily said, she knew the journals lived in my desk. I had trusted her with the spare key, a small gold promise. Sophie said, "You hid truths I deserve to read." The gall rang like a cracked bell. Liam said I was just trying to calm her down. His voice skated the edge of an apology without landing. Grace said, "Truth without consent is violence." The sentence steadied me like a railing on wet stairs. I pictured my pages paraded like trophies. I swore to gather what had been torn and decide what the ruin meant. Inside, the desk sat like a crime scene without tape. Emily said, "This is where we plotted our futures." The drawer slid, and the absence gaped. Sophie said, "I only showed them what was real." The word real felt counterfeit in my chest. Liam said, "I begged her to stop." The voice memo clicked and sighed. Grace said, "Document everything before rage edits memory." I photographed the scratch near the lock and the smudge on the handle. I felt my pulse map each betrayal, as if counting debts due at dawn. The group chat pinged with a new post that made my stomach crawl. Emily said, "She framed my grief as drama." A photo of me crying last winter anchored the feed like a hook. Sophie said, "People deserve the unfiltered story." The sanctimony tasted like ash. Liam said, "This is spiraling. Meet me at the square." I heard trains in his background, a clock running out. Grace said, "Choose silence until you choose your power." I closed the app and the room sighed with me. The rain eased, and a pale band of light found my wall like a dare. The first anchor of our bond was stitched together in a forgotten high school gym, under flickering fluorescent lights and the creak of a banner sagging with age. Emily said, "Sophie, you made failure feel less heavy when you stood beside me." Her words still rang when the silence had tried to suffocate me. Sophie said, "We are each other's safety pin, keeping the broken edges from falling apart." That sentence stuck deeper than any speech from a teacher or mentor. We sat cross-legged on cold wooden bleachers, sharing soda that had gone flat, whispering fears into the echo of the space. Emily said, "Promise me we'll never laugh at each other's fears, no matter how strange." Sophie hooked her pinky with mine, sealing a vow that felt older than our years. Grace stood nearby, camera trembling in her hands, and said, "You two are magnets, even the light bends toward you." That photo lived on our phones, burned like proof of loyalty. Back then, nothing seemed strong enough to shake us. If betrayal had been written in the stars, the night sky refused to show it. The first apartment we shared was barely more than peeling paint and creaking pipes, but to us it was a kingdom carved from hope. Emily said, "This is headquarters, our fortress where no shame enters." We ate pizza straight from boxes, floor serving as both table and bed, our laughter filling the air like curtains against the draft. Sophie said, "One day, we'll build a studio where no one silences us," and she scrawled our dreams on the fridge with a stolen marker. Grace arrived with thrift store mugs clinking like treasure, setting them down with pride. Grace said, "Every victory deserves a vessel, and every wound deserves one too." Liam leaned in from the hallway, a guest not yet friend, and said, "I like the sound of a fortress," his grin unsteady but honest. Emily said, "We have rituals now. Birthdays last a week. Heartbreaks get playlists. We believed those rules could carry us through anything. Back then, loyalty was painted in neon across our walls. The night of the open mic stitched Liam into our orbit like fate. Strings buzzed under flickering cafe lights as his voice cracked through static. Emily said, "Your song feels like a window I never knew I needed." Liam smiled shy, adjusting a cable, unaware that his presence would shift the ground beneath us. Sophie said, "You're hired for the studio that doesn't exist yet," and scribbled his name on a napkin with a star beside it. Emily said, "You belong with us," and meant it. Grace shook her head but smiled, saying, "You're chaos magnets, and now you're pulling him too." After the show, we split a pretzel on the curb, laughing until salt stained our cheeks. Liam said, "You carry the kind of friendship that people write songs about." The night air was cool, but the warmth between us burned brighter than the stage lights had. If only I had known how fragile harmony could be before discord unraveled us. Under the rusted gate of our college, loyalty was sworn with a brass key passed between us like treasure. Emily said, "This key is our vault. Nothing leaves without consent." Sophie pressed the cool metal into my hand, her eyes steady with something I mistook for reverence. Sophie said, "If the world turns cruel, this will remind us we are stronger." Liam chuckled softly, saying, "Every empire needs a symbol," and pointed at the key dangling from my palm. Grace said, "Symbols are heavy if you forget what they stand for." We laughed then, believing laughter meant permanence. Emily said, "We carved a kingdom tonight." The gate groaned in the wind like a warning none of us heard. Years later I would feel that brass digging into my hand, not as a promise, but as evidence of how power can be abused even in friendship. The karaoke bar became our cathedral, neon and noise, replacing stained glass and hymns. Emily said, "If we're off key, it means we're alive." Sophie screamed pop anthems into the microphone, her voice breaking but radiant, and I laughed until I couldn't breathe. Liam banged the table with drumstick fingers, chanting the chorus. Liam said, "You're the loudest joy I know." Grace shook her head but her grin betrayed her affection. Grace said, "You are chaos, but chaos stitched well is still beautiful." Sophie said, "This booth is sacred ground. No betrayal can live here." We carved our initials into plastic seats, as if eternity could be melted into vinyl. Emily said, "This is forever, right here." The neon soaked us in pink and blue, and for that moment, forever seemed possible. I see now that neon burns out, leaving only darkness behind. The first crack showed when Sophie skipped my call after Liam's set, though her phone had glowed in her lap. Emily said, "She must have a reason." But my chest itched with questions. Sophie said, "I lost track of time, her laugh too thin to hold." Liam said, "I saw her outside, but maybe I imagined it." His voice quivered like he knew more than he shared. Grace said, "Don't ignore patterns because they come dressed as accidents." I forced myself to believe in coincidence, but coincidence kept knocking too often. My trust, once thick as stone, began thinning like wet paper in the rain. Later, my journal sat askew on the desk, a page folded wrong. Emily said, "I never fold pages, Sophie." I remembered her laughter as she borrowed pens last week. Sophie said, "I was only curious about your sketches." But sketches were secrets in disguise. Liam said, "She mentioned lines that weren't hers, and guilt carved his words." Grace said, "Curiosity is a mask thieves wear." I touched the crease like it was a wound, small but bleeding. I wanted to believe Sophie still held the spare key with reverence, not hunger. But the lock knew otherwise. At the diner, Sophie leaned too close to Liam, her laugh spilling like syrup, while my coffee cooled untouched. Emily said, "Why does her hand linger on his sleeve?" My throat burned with questions I couldn't voice. Sophie said, "He just gets my jokes faster." Liam said, "It's not what it looks like," though no one had asked. Grace said, "Jealousy whispers loudest when truth hides." My stomach turned at the sight of my best friend's grin bent toward him, a grin once mine to trust. The pancakes went cold, and so did something in me. The group chat began to shift, Sophie answering late, her tone sharp where it once was soft. Emily said, "We always plan together, why am I finding out last?" Sophie said, "Not everything needs your approval." The words felt like knives wrapped in sugar. Liam said, "I thought we'd all go to the show," his text trailing with confusion. Grace said, "Exclusion is the first cousin of betrayal." I scrolled through messages that once carried joy but now hummed with distance. My thumb trembled, as though even the screen wanted me gone. I found Sophie's perfume lingering on my jacket, though she hadn't hugged me in days. Emily said, "She borrowed this coat when she left, didn't she?" My breath caught in its trace. Sophie said, "You imagine too much," her smile refusing to meet my eyes. Liam said, "She brushed past me wearing your hoodie." The words lodged sharp. Grace said, "Evidence is not imagination." I stood in the mirror holding the coat like an artifact, wondering when warmth turned into theft. The betrayal was no longer distant. It had already entered my skin. The truth detonated when a friend tagged me in a photo that wasn't meant for my eyes. Emily said, "That's Sophie in my jacket," leaning into Liam. The image shimmered like a cruel mirror. Sophie said, "It's not what you think," but the caption already spelled betrayal. Liam said, "She kissed me first," and his words fractured the silence like glass underfoot. Grace said, "You cannot heal what refuses to name itself." The memory of their laughter last night turned venomous, and the world tilted. My chest ached, but denial finally bled out. The cafe where we built our rituals now reeked of ghosts. Emily said, "This table used to hold promises." Sophie sat across from me, phone face down, tapping nails like hammers. Sophie said, "I didn't betray you, I just chose myself." The words carried poison sweetened with charm. Liam said, "I didn't mean to be part of this," his eyes fixed on the floor. Grace said, "You rewrite history with every sentence." The cappuccino steamed between us, untouched, while trust curdled into something sour. The betrayal deepened when I found my handwriting twisted in Sophie's post, words stolen from my private pages. Emily said, "She took my grief and dressed it as her art." Sophie said, "People need truth, even if it's ugly." Liam said, "You should have asked before you made her a villain." His defense cut deeper than Sophie's crime. Grace said, "Truth without consent is theft." I stared at the screen, seeing not just betrayal but violation. My voice trembled, but the silence that followed screamed louder. At the square, Sophie faced me like a victor, not a friend. Emily said, "Why use my heartache as currency?" Sophie said, "Because your silence gave me nothing." Liam said, "I tried to stop her, but she wanted the stage." Grace said, "This is not ambition, it's cannibalism." My chest felt carved open while Sophie smiled, as if the theft were art. The fountain roared behind us, drowning every memory we had built with its crashing truth. The final blow of the twist came when Sophie looked me in the eye, no apology, no mask. Sophie said, "I was always jealous of how they loved you more." Emily said, "You chose envy over us." Liam said, "I never wanted to be the reason." Grace said, "The mask is gone, and what's left is cruelty." The confession cracked the ground beneath my feet, erasing years in one breath. The friend I once trusted with every secret now stood as stranger, dagger bare. The storm broke beneath the square's neon signs as the rain returned, drumming on stone. Emily said, "You didn't just betray me, you carved me open." Sophie said, I only took what you hoarded. The air snapped like live wires. Liam said, stop before we destroy everything. Grace said, it is already destroyed. My voice grew raw, rising with the thunder. The fountain sprayed cold mist that clung to our clothes, but nothing cooled the fire between us. We weren't friends anymore. We were soldiers in a war built from laughter, turned to shrapnel. The words turned to weapons sharper than any blade. Emily said, you fed my secrets to strangers. Sophie said, secrets rot when hidden too long. Liam said, you never should have done this. His voice cracked, torn between two fires. Grace said, you confuse honesty with cruelty. The rain blurred my tears, or maybe my tears blurred the rain. Every syllable burned my throat, but silence was more unbearable. I hurled truth like stones, and each one hit the ruins of what we had built. Voices rose until even the square itself seemed to listen. Emily said, you wanted my life, my love, my words. Sophie said, I wanted proof I mattered. Liam said, you mattered without stealing. His hands trembled, his loyalty split. Grace said, your hunger leaves nothing but ashes. Thunder rolled like applause for the collapse of our empire. For a heartbeat I wanted to grab Sophie and beg her back into the warmth, but the knife between us glimmered too sharp. The fight burned hotter, voices echoing against buildings. Emily said, all I ever gave you was trust. Sophie said, all you ever gave me was your shadow. Liam said, you're both tearing me apart. Grace said, let her hear her own cruelty. My breath came in jagged shards, chest bruised by rage. Sophie's eyes blazed not with guilt, but with hunger satisfied. My heart broke in the space her apology never lived. The rain drowned every apology I once imagined. The climax cracked wide when Sophie stepped closer, her voice low but lethal. Sophie said, I would do it again. Emily said, then you were never my friend. Liam said, this is the end of us. Grace said, the truth finally shows its teeth. Lightning flared, and the square glowed like a stage built for tragedy. The air was filled with thunder, but none of it louder than the silence that followed. For the first time I stopped fighting, because I knew the friendship was already dead. The rain slowed, but the silence after Sophie's words carried more weight than thunder ever could. Emily said, the friendship is gone, but the ghost still lingers. My chest felt like a hollow room where laughter used to echo. Sophie said, you'll thank me one day for setting you free, her voice cruel in its calmness. Liam said, there is no freedom in breaking something sacred. His shoulders sagged, every word lined with regret. Grace said, the hardest truths are those that leave you bleeding long after the cut. I walked away, every step heavy, shoes dragging against the soaked pavement, as though the city itself tried to hold me still. Memories pressed against me with the weight of years, late-night toasts, pinky promises, scribbled notes hidden in lockers. Emily said, those pieces are mine, but she stained them. I reached the corner, looked back, and for the first time, didn't hope to see her chasing me. The apartment smelled like wet paper and betrayal. Emily said every corner here remembers her. My desk, my shelves, the mugs Grace gave us, all relics of a friendship embalmed. Sophie said, you can't erase me from your history, echoing in my mind as if the walls repeated it. Liam said, you shouldn't be alone right now, his voice reaching through voicemail that I couldn't answer. Grace said, you are not alone, even when she wants you to believe you are. I touched the journals she hadn't stolen, running fingers over their spines as though they might collapse. Emily said, these pages survived, so maybe I can too. The air was still heavy, but survival flickered faintly in its corners. I wandered through the park where Sophie and I once carved our initials into bark, only to find them scarred deeper, as if time itself mocked me. Emily said, we wrote forever, but forever has teeth. Sophie said, memories are mine too, though her absence screamed louder than her words. Liam said, the park feels different without her laughter, a message left unread on my phone. Grace said, laughter can rot when it's built on envy. My palm traced the old carving, and splinters bit my skin, grounding me. Emily said, "Let this pain remind me what I will not forgive." The breeze carried both the scent of damp earth and the ache of endings, and still I stood rooted, learning the weight of letting go. At Grace's kitchen table, the silence was gentler, though still laced with sorrow. Emily said, "I don't know how to hold myself without her shadow beside me." Grace said, "You hold yourself the same way you always have, just without her hand pressing yours down." She slid me tea in one of the old mismatched mugs, the chipped one Sophie once claimed as her favorite. "All," Emily said, "she claimed everything, even the smallest pieces of me." Grace said, "Now you reclaim them." Liam said, "I wish I could undo what I allowed," his voice faint through another voicemail. The steam rose between us, curling like forgiveness I wasn't ready for. Emily said, "Maybe survival isn't about peace, but about choosing who still deserves a seat at my table." The rain stopped, the city rinsed clean but not me. Emily said, "The world moves forward even when I am cracked open." Sophie said, "You'll never be whole without me," her phantom voice whispering doubt. Liam said, "You are stronger than this betrayal," his words left hanging in a message I hadn't answered. Grace said, "Strength is not silence. It's choosing when to speak again." I stood by the window, light falling across my face like a scar turned to gold. Emily said, "She broke the friendship, but she will not define the ending." My chest hurt, but somewhere in the ache, a breath came easier. The wound would stay, but maybe wounds could also teach me where never to trust again. The city pulsed with ordinary life, but every sound seemed sharper, as if mocking the silence Sophie left behind. Emily said, "Even traffic lights feel louder without her laughter beside me." Sophie said, "I gave you scars, and scars sing louder than promises." Liam said, "I should have stopped this, but stopping came too late." Grace said, "She took your trust, but she cannot take your future." I walked along cracked sidewalks, shoes scuffing against grit, remembering how we once mapped dreams on these very streets. Emily said, "I thought we would grow old sharing secrets, not wounds." My reflection in every rain puddle felt like a stranger I was learning to meet. The cafe door creaked as I entered the place where loyalty once felt eternal. Emily said, "This booth remembers every vow we broke." Sophie said, "Vows fade, but betrayal leaves permanence." Liam said, "I can't sit here without hearing your voices fight." Grace said, "Then fill this space with new truths instead." The cappuccino foam blurred as tears stung my eyes, but I didn't wipe them away. Emily said, "Her shadow lingers, but so do I." I let the silence wrap me like armor, realizing memory couldn't erase me, only remind me. The same walls that once echoed with trust now taught me resilience. The park bench groaned under me, as if it too carried the weight of old stories. Emily said, "Here we once believed forever could be carved in bark." Sophie said, "Forever was too small for my envy." Liam said, "I see the wound growing in both of you and regret not cutting it sooner." Grace said, "Regret is lighter than betrayal, but still heavy to hold." The breeze stirred fallen leaves, each one a memory lifted and scattered. Emily said, "Let the wind carry her pieces away." My palms pressed into the bench, grounding me, while the tree stood scarred but unbroken, teaching me survival. At Grace's kitchen table again, I finally exhaled the storm. Emily said, "I thought ending a friendship would kill me, but maybe it only reshapes me." Sophie said, "You'll never find loyalty that deep again," her phantom voice sneering. Liam said, "Forgive me, though I may not deserve it," his message unread. Grace said, "You owe no forgiveness to anyone but yourself." I cradled the chipped mug Sophie once claimed, now mine again, and let the steam wash over my face like absolution. Emily said, "The fragments may cut, but they are mine to arrange into something new." The silence held me, not as a void, but as a space to rebuild. The city lights flickered alive as night fell, and with them came a clarity sharper than grief. Emily said, "I lost my best friend the day I found out who she really was." Sophie said, "You will carry me forever, whether you want to or not." Liam said, "I wish the ending had been different, but endings rarely bow to wishes." Grace said, "You carry the scar, but it will remind you of strength, not weakness." I looked at the skyline, every tower, a reminder that survival doesn't erase the wound, but builds higher above it. Emily said, "They didn't just betray me, they betrayed every version of us we could have been." The words lingered, like a final echo, quiet but unshakable.